Hey everyone, this is Andrew from Mann, and today we're going to talk about some things to look for as we approach into June and July in our beekeeping season. In our previous video, we talked about April and May and how in the southeast, if our brood is moving quickly and we're seeing a lot more brood, then we can be assured that we're also raising mites at the same time. In that previous video, we talked about doing a mite count and getting some mite treatments on earlier in the season than most of us would typically think about. With that being said, we're going to be coming into a time in the year where it starts getting a lot more humid, it gets a lot hotter, and there's no secret, a lot of the beekeepers, commercially speaking, that are in the southeast start moving north for their summer. So what do we do if we are permanent residents in the southeast and we don't have the ability to travel to a different location in the summer? Well, we are going to have to be ready to feed our bees. It's very simple. What happens when we are come out of the spring, our colony is at a precipice. Without feed in those dearth months, that colony is going to regress. It's going to start eating on its stores, and that queen could pull up on her laying pattern, the amount of brood she lays. A lot of that is dependent on the food sources that the bees see coming into the hive. So remember, if the queen and that colony is not seeing an adequate amount of feed coming into that colony, she will for sure pull up on the amount of brood that she is laying because there was not enough feed and food resources coming in to keep the colony sustainable. So what do we do as beekeepers? Well, we've got a couple of options. We could feed sugar water. We went over that in a previous video on ProSweet and ProHealth. We talked about sucrose. Let's talk about it again. Sucrose would be a 2-to-1 mixture of come out at about 66-67% solids, and most of us can make that in our own kitchen. That's going to tell the queen that there is a nectar flow still happening. It will still entice those bees to continue to draw wax, which will help her continue to lay eggs. If we don't want to make our own sucrose, there are other options. You could feed a product like ProSweet. ProSweet is going to be a combination of sucrose, fructose, and glucose, and that is going to give the bees the right amount of sucrose to continue to draw comb and to lay, but it's also going to give them an adequate amount of fructose and glucose where they're going to be able to cap whatever they store in that cell immediately. That's important because if they go to a period where it gets dearthy and there's no food reserves for them, they will go into that, and that is what they will have. So we've got to feed. That's going to allow that colony to continue to move forward. What a lot of people forget is how critical pollen is. And without getting too in the weeds, pollen is fed to your brood. And your honey, your nectar, your carbohydrates are fed to your adult bees. It's split. Adult bees do not consume pollen. And so if there isn't enough pollen in that hive, then there is certainly not enough food to continue to feed the brood, regardless of how much sucrose or syrup you're feeding that colony. So remember, you've got a couple of options. If you're in an area with higher than average hive beetle, you might want to think about putting out a dry pollen. If you put out a dry pollen, you set that up further out in your apiary, and you're going to see the bees forage and hitting it. One of the great benefits with dry pollen is those bees are going to forage like they would naturally, bring in those pollen pellets into the hive, put them through invertis, and make their bee bread. It's going to eliminate or greatly reduce the risk of having hive beetles infiltrate your hive due to too much pollen or pollen patties. And the other really cool benefit about dry pollen, which a lot of people don't realize, is that if a flow turns on and the bees are not touching that pollen, they're telling you they're getting pollen elsewhere. That is more beneficial for them, which is fine. But at the very least, you know that if they are hitting that pollen hard, they're telling you that There is nothing out there for us. That is what we need right now. And so, your colony is going to benefit from having that available. The other thing you can think about is feeding a patty. Now, Mann Lake has a lot of different options, and some of them, you've got your Ultra B, the original. You've got Ultra B Plus. It comes with a 5% natural pollen. There is an option for a 15% natural pollen. And then we've got our Ultra B Rocket Fuel, which is with the Apis Biologics and natural pollen. If you're concerned about feeding pollen patties due to hive beetles, there's a couple things that you can do. For one, you can reduce the amount of pollen patty you give that hive. So try feeding them half of a pollen patty. Let them consume that first and then put the other half on. You might have to go back to the hive more than once in order to do that, but you're going to reduce that risk of having too many hive beetles. Another thing that you could do with the pollen patty is simply just rip it up. Rip that pollen patty up into 7 or 8 pieces. When bees feed on a pollen patty, they feed on it from the outside in. So when you feed an entire pollen patty as such right into that hive, that it gives a huge amount of room for hive beetles to lay in the middle of that pollen patty. However, if you break this pollen patty up into 6 or 7 pieces, you're going to have bees all around that surface area 6 or 7 times. It makes it nearly impossible for hive beetles to get into those smaller pieces simply because there's not a lot of room for them to go before they're running into bees that are corralling them out and taking care of the hive the way that they should be able to. So those are options, right? If you want your bees to forage on a dry patty or give them a direct feed, right into the hive. So as we approach June and July, it's critical to remember we've looked for mites. Hopefully we've treated them. If we've found any at a threshold that suggests that we should treat them. And now that we're coming into a very hot, humid, rainy part of the year in the southeast, we want to make sure that we're ready to feed. It's one thing that we know we have to feed, and it's another to be ready to feed. As soon as that hive starts pulling up on natural resources, as a beekeeper, we continue to put that feed on them. Now, as that colony grew in the spring, it's not going to have to take that step back in the summer where it drops down. That way, when we're coming into the fall, they're not rebuilding that colony. Instead, we see a steady growth in that colony over the next 3, 4, 5 months, which will again allow us to have a much more successful start to our fall. For more information, stay tuned, and we're looking forward to bringing it to you. Have a great day.